Welcome to the Sack for Ron Think podcast. Today, we're going to look at part two of how EDI took over the workplace. And in this article, which was first published in May last year, 2024, we looked at how EDI took over the British workplace in response to the George Floyd killing and lockdown, which created a very particular set of circumstances that allowed policies and procedures to be implemented into workplaces that probably wouldn't have got through the gatekeepers had the workplaces been functioning normally. Today, I want to look at how EDI has been forced on to small businesses, SMEs, small to medium enterprises, by procurement departments and through investment from both public sector and also private sector. And this is particularly pernicious because it forces SMEs to implement quite radical politics into their own organizations. And whilst a large organization may be able to cope with the subsequent fallout in breakdown of employee relations, intra-employee relations, and also productivity, small businesses certainly can't. So without further ado, I'm going to plunge into this article, first published in May 2024 in the Daily Skeptic. Earlier this month, I published an article exploring how Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, EDI, took over the British workplace, focusing on the response to the George Floyd killing and how this, with lockdown, created a huge demand for EDI, lowering the quality and elevating EDI from a minor sub-department in HR to a core function of organisations. Now, in part two, we explore how corporate environment, social responsibility and governance, ESG policies, are driving EDI and political ideologies into smaller businesses. So first of all, why is EDI an issue? Let's recap on this. Surely it is a good idea. Well, since the CAS report earlier this year, this is 2024, the publication of the Department of Business and Trade's report into EDI in March 2024, the Free Speech Union's Donata report into EDI April 2024, and the Policy Exchange report of May 2024, I will list links to all these reports below, suggest that there are significant concerns that the road to hell appears to be paved with good intentions. All these reports highlight significant issues with EDI as it has been implemented and indicate that it is having the opposite effect of that intended, driving division, exclusion, isolation, stress, fear, and ultimately job losses, with hundreds of thousands having left their employment due to their reaction to EDI training or having been fired, possibly unlawfully, for having opinions that clash with those being taught through EDI. And you can read about this in another article I wrote in the Daily Skeptic. A link will be provided below. Encouragingly, there is now an open discussion amongst a small number of influential human resources people on LinkedIn since March this year. This has simply not happened before, with any dissenters being silenced through personal attacks or blocked by LinkedIn themselves. The topic of this discussion is the negative impact poor EDI is having on productivity, staff turnover, and therefore revenue, and how this can no longer be ignored. The Free Speech Union's report, quoted above, makes for some very concerning reading. There is often a misconception that most people in Britain work in large organisations. It is depressing that every time a politician comes up with another business initiative, they secure the backing of large corporates, completely ignoring that most people in the UK, 63% of us, work in small to medium-sized businesses, i.e. under 250 employees. SMEs account for 99.9% of all UK businesses, yet the report indicates that 65% of UK employees have experienced some form of EDI training either at their workplace or at their most recent workplace. So why are so many SMEs putting their staff through EDI training? I run an SME, and having run several and worked for many over the years, I can tell you now that SMEs rarely, if ever, provide superfluous training to their employees, preferring only to train when there is a contractual or statutory requirement to do so. With tight resources, there is simply not enough time to spend investing in training that is not directly related to the job or role in question, even if we wanted to. So if that is the case, why are SMEs training EDI? Well, the answer is that clients demand that they do before they are considered fit to supply. Much of this, sadly, is news for the general public, and it shows the mendacity around using procurement to drive political ideologies. Such demands are made under the curtain of commercial confidentiality and can therefore be hidden from public access requests. We've seen a similar tactic in education, where activists hide content from parents behind commercial confidentiality contracts. About 30 years ago, we started to see the idea of a sustainable procurement entering the procurement profession. This was sensible. It was part of what used to be called corporate responsibility. Sustainable procurement meant that you worked with companies which had firm policies around things like health and safety, ethical waste disposal policies, ethical sourcing, etc. As time went by, we saw environmental issues being added. Suppliers had to demonstrate they were actively reducing carbon emissions. We also began to see the S, social responsibility, becoming part of this. Customers wanted reassurance that suppliers took issues like discrimination seriously. By 2004, the United Nations had formally identified ESG as an idea in their report, Who Cares Wins. ESG was now here to stay. And who could possibly argue that it was a bad idea? Well, as I've already said once in this article, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We were told that people were increasingly concerned about social justice and environmental justice, although we were never told who was concerned or how much they were concerned. Controversial policies like net zero were added into the ESG mix. Controversial because they had not been debated. People were unilaterally informed that they had no choice but to comply with these new policies, no matter how much they cost. Diversity was narrowly defined as diversity of appearance, sexuality, gender, ability, rather than diversity of experience, thought, and opinion. Inclusion was corrupted through intersectional identity politics, and affirmative action was now based on immutable characteristics of identity groups, based on assumed privilege rather than on individual socioeconomic circumstances. By the 2010s, private equity firms were putting ESG front and center, making a condition of investment. The World Economic Forum developed a points system so companies could assess their ESG rating. Suddenly, it mattered whether or not your company celebrated Pride, and scores were allocated for increasingly radical support for increasingly radical ideas. This was corporate wokery, the deliberate politicization of the corporate world, so companies could now be used to drive recalcitrant populations into accepting increasingly left-wing radical policies. As society took a large leap to the left in the 2010s, the population was told that it was unacceptable to question the new givens. So to question net zero, whether trans women are women, or to ask why affirmative action resulted in lots of public school educated black people working at the BBC and no working class Glaswegians, and you were not only told to shut up, you were smeared as being intolerant, deplorable, a racist, homophobe, transphobe, etc. As the new orthodoxies were adopted wholesale by the establishment, they were added to ESG and therefore procurement requirements. It was no longer sufficient to demonstrate that your business had an anti-slavery policy and an asbestos policy. You had to demonstrate that you were ideologically aligned. So procurement started to demand evidence that equality or equity, diversity, and inclusion was being taken seriously by suppliers, and provide evidence not just of policies, but also evidence of training. So if you were selling paperclips to your local NHS trust, suddenly you had to demonstrate that you had an EDI policy, that you trained your staff in EDI. Small businesses would frequently turn to the internet and in a box-ticking exercise purchase the cheapest online EDI training available. Unfortunately, as we've learned from the reports quoted above, EDI needs to be very carefully and sensitively deployed, and even more carefully trained if you do not wish to end up pissing off a significant proportion of your workforce. 63% in the Free Speech Union report. Poor quality EDI is likely to create significant issues for SMEs, and any issue that impacts the happiness and well-being of staff is far more of a problem for smaller employers who cannot afford staff turnover issues or disengage disinterested staff. A constant refrain of woke policies is that in their rush to force them onto people, those advocating them forget two major points. Firstly, they lied about the positions taken by ESG and EDI as being settled and beyond debate, to the point that if you dare question them, you are morally reprehensible. Secondly, that social engineering, which is what this is both extremely complex and difficult to do successfully. Crude attempts to force radical ideologies onto a population are always doomed to fail when the population starts to question why even asking a question is unacceptable. All it takes is for someone to point out that the emperor is wearing no clothes and the whole edifice comes crashing down. And that is what we're beginning to see now. People are no longer afraid of being smeared as something they are not for simply questioning the adoption of a radical policy that was fringe until a few days ago. They tend to react badly when unconscious bias trainers call them all incorrigible bigots who need to be fixed by their employers. Corporate activism is collapsing all over the world because, like its partner in politics, it has overreached itself. It is one thing to ensure that a supplier disposes of its wastewater properly. It is quite another to demand that the same supplier sends its management team on your EDI training courses, as happened to one of our clients recently at an NHS trust. Get woke, go broke is being proven from Hollywood to Hull. People are weary, fed up, bored of the constant demands of activists. They've woken up to the cynicism of corporate wokery, and they are voting with their feet and their wallets. Last week, this was in May 2024, Kemi Badenoch, who was then the UK's Business and Trade Secretary, urged businesses to focus on their customers and to avoid politics and activism. So ingrained is the issue that her own department, the Royal Academy of Engineers, was recruiting another EDI specialist to join its existing team of 15 EDI specialists. With Pride 2024 on the cards for June 2024, we could fully expect the volume around this debate to increase, and indeed it did. However, the pressure on SMEs is relentless, and it's our opinion that unless specific legislation is written protecting employees from political or ideological training in the workplace, this issue will not be solved anytime soon. Of course, an entire industry has built up to supply training in diversity, inclusivity, and allyship. A quick glance at LinkedIn will indicate how absurd this has become, with one consultant urging men to get their nails decorated for inclusion. But more seriously is this blog article from lawyers Shoosmiths advising corporate clients how to drive, read bully, EDI down their supply chains. So what about SMEs who are being forced to implement EDI by corporate or public sector procurement departments? How do you tick the boxes without damaging your business? If you refuse, you'll simply be dropped as supplier. Well, we also set up fairjob.co.uk, which is an HR consultancy that brings back common sense to the workplace. So if you are being asked for these things to comply by your clients, please do get in touch and we will help you navigate this and also to repair any damage caused by poor EDI to date. Get in touch if you think you need some help for your organization or business. We are seeing that the worm may have turned against the politicization of the workplace, but there is a long way to go. At the time, I said if Labour wins next month, it could get worse before it gets any better. And I think that last sentence has come home to roost. It does seem to be getting worse before it gets any better. A development since I wrote this article is that the Labour Party are now talking about legislating to force public sector organisations to force EDI into their supply chain with a statutory requirement. Now, the reality is that it's pretty much ubiquitous anyway, but statutory will make it very difficult for small businesses to push back and suppliers to push back. If you are finding yourself in this situation, get in touch with us at www.fairjob.co.uk and we can help. In the meantime, please subscribe to Sacked for Wrong Think. We really appreciate it if you can follow us and if you can share this podcast on your feeds. It would be very, very helpful to us. If you can afford it, please consider joining our Substack as a paid subscriber. We are reliant on your donations and subscriptions in order to publish. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time.